Hazel Blythe had convinced herself that kitchens were just temporary shelters, not homes. For 3 years, she'd drifted between ranches like tumbleweeds, cooking meals for strangers who never learned her middle name. But when 6-year-old Abby Ford whispered those 8 words after supper, "I picked you to be my mama," something inside Hazel's chest cracked open like an egg. The child's small hand found hers in the lamplight, and suddenly every mile Hazel had wandered felt like steps toward this moment. She thought she'd been running from something, but maybe she'd been running towards someone all along. Subscribe to discover if a drifting heart can finally find its way home. The stagecoach wheels carved deep ruts in the Wyoming dust, each turn bringing Hazel Blythe closer to another temporary arrangement. She pressed her palm against the worn leather satchel containing her knives, her only constants in a world that changed with every sunset. Through the window, endless prairie stretched toward mountains that looked like sleeping giants, their peaks touched with early snow that reminded her of the grandmother's hair she'd never known. The other passenger, a traveling preacher with kind eyes, had stopped trying to make conversation after Hazel's third monosyllabic response. She wasn't being rude. She simply had nothing left to give to strangers who would forget her name before the next town. Dry Creek appeared on the horizon like a mirage made of weathered wood and broken dreams. The buildings leaned against each other as if seeking comfort, their paint peeled away by wind and time until only the bones of ambition remained. Hazel counted 12 structures total: a general store, a saloon with swinging doors that creaked even when still, a church with a bell tower that listed slightly to the left, and scattered houses that looked like they'd been dropped from the sky by an indifferent god. This was the kind of place where people came to disappear, and Hazel had become an expert at vanishing. She'd answered the advertisement for a cook with the same detachment she brought to everything else. It was work, it was temporary, and it would end. The Ford Ranch sat 3 miles outside town, accessible only by a dirt road that seemed to lead nowhere and everywhere at once. Hazel's first glimpse of the property revealed a modest 2-story house, painted white but faded to the color of old bones, surrounded by corrals and outbuildings that spoke of practical needs rather than aesthetic dreams. A windmill turned lazily in the afternoon breeze, its metal blades catching sunlight and throwing it back in brief, brilliant flashes. The barn stood solid and red against the endless sky, and horses moved through the pasture with the unhurried grace of creatures who understood that time meant nothing to the prairie. Everything about the place whispered of quiet endurance, of people who had learned to find beauty in survival. Jeremiah Ford emerged from the barn as the hired wagon approached, and Hazel's first thought was that he looked like a man carved from the same wood as his fence posts. Weathered, strong, and built to last. His dark hair showed threads of silver at the temples, and his eyes held the particular shade of blue that came from staring at wide skies for too many years. He moved with the careful economy of someone who had learned that wasted motion was wasted life, his boots raising small clouds of dust with each step. When he removed his hat to greet her, Hazel noticed the pale line across his forehead where the sun hadn't touched, a reminder that even the strongest men needed protection from the elements. Their introduction was brief and practical, conducted in the space between the wagon and the front porch, while her single trunk was unloaded. Jeremiah's voice carried the rough texture of a man who spent more time talking to horses than people, and his handshake was firm but fleeting, as if physical contact was a luxury he couldn't afford. He explained the household routine with the efficiency of someone reading a grocery list: breakfast at dawn, dinner at noon, supper at sunset, and a little girl who needed tending when he was working the far pastures. Hazel nodded at appropriate intervals, mentally cataloguing the information while studying the lines around his eyes that spoke of laughter that had been buried too deep to surface easily. The house welcomed her with the scent of beeswax and lavender, evidence of a woman's touch that lingered like a ghost in the carefully arranged furniture and hand-sewn curtains. Hazel's room was small but clean, with a window that faced east toward the sunrise, and a quilt that had been stitched with the kind of patience that only came from love. As she unpacked her few belongings, she could hear the distant sound of a child's laughter drifting through the walls, bright and musical, against the backdrop of settling wood and creaking floorboards. For the first time in months, Hazel allowed herself to wonder if this place might be different, if the temporary arrangement might stretch into something that resembled permanence, even as she reminded herself that hoping was the fastest way to heartbreak. Abby Ford appeared in the kitchen doorway, like a sunbeam given human form, all golden curls and eyes the same impossible blue as her father's, but filled with the fearless curiosity that belonged only to children who had never learned that the world could be cruel. She wore a yellow dress that had been mended at the hem with careful stitches, and her bare feet made no sound on the wooden floor as she approached Hazel with the confidence of someone who had never met a stranger she couldn't charm. The child's presence filled the room with an energy that made the air itself seem lighter, and Hazel found herself smiling before she realized she was doing it. There was something about Abby that bypassed all of Hazel's carefully constructed defenses, slipping past her walls like water through cracks in stone. The afternoon passed in a dance of domestic rhythm that felt both foreign and familiar to Hazel's wandering heart. Abby perched on a wooden stool beside the stove, chattering about her doll named Rosie and the baby calf that had been born last week, and how her papa sometimes sang to the horses when he thought no one was listening. Her voice carried the musical quality of childhood, rising and falling with excitement as she described her world with the enthusiasm of someone who found magic in ordinary things. Hazel listened while she prepared supper, her hands moving automatically through the familiar motions of chopping vegetables and seasoning meat. But her attention was captured entirely by this small person who seemed to glow from within. When Jeremiah returned from the fields, the kitchen had been transformed into something that resembled a home rather than just a place where food was prepared. The table was set with mismatched plates that somehow looked perfect together, and the smell of roasted chicken and fresh biscuits filled the air with promises of comfort and nourishment. Abby had insisted on picking wildflowers for a centerpiece, and the purple and yellow blooms sat in a mason jar like a celebration of simple beauty. Jeremiah paused in the doorway, his hat in his hands, and something unreadable flickering across his features as he took in the scene. For a moment, Hazel thought she saw a crack in his careful composure, a glimpse of the man he might have been before life taught him to guard his heart so carefully. Supper was a quiet affair, punctuated by Abby's gentle chatter and the soft clink of silverware against china. Jeremiah ate with the methodical attention of someone who understood food as fuel rather than pleasure, but Hazel noticed the way his eyes softened when Abby described her day, how his mouth almost curved into a smile when she announced that Miss Hazel made the best biscuits in all of Wyoming. The child had a gift for drawing people out of themselves, for making even the most guarded souls feel safe enough to lower their defenses. Hazel found herself sharing stories of her travels, describing the different kitchens she'd worked in and the peculiar habits of various employers, while Jeremiah listened with an attention that felt like a gift. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the kitchen walls with golden light that made everything look touched by magic, Abby helped clear the table with the serious concentration of someone performing an important ritual. She stacked plates with careful precision and wiped down surfaces with a cloth that was almost too big for her small hands, humming a tune that sounded like something her mother might have sung. Jeremiah excused himself to check on the animals, leaving Hazel and Abby alone in the warm circle of lamplight that had begun to push back the gathering darkness. The child moved around the kitchen with the familiarity of someone who belonged there completely, and Hazel felt a strange pang of something that might have been envy for that kind of rootedness. When the dishes were washed and put away, when the kitchen had been restored to order and the lamps trimmed for the night, Abby approached Hazel with the solemnity of someone about to share a great secret. The child's small hand slipped into Hazel's larger one with the trust that only children possessed, and her voice dropped to a whisper that seemed to contain all the hope in the world. "I picked you to be my mama," she said, her blue eyes serious and certain, as if she had been waiting her entire 6 years to deliver this message. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning an impossible distance, and Hazel felt something inside her chest crack open with a sound like breaking ice, releasing feelings she had spent years trying to bury beneath the safety of constant motion. The morning came too soon, dragging with it the harsh reality of what had transpired the night before. Hazel found herself standing at the kitchen window, watching the sun bleed orange across the Wyoming sky, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. Sleep had been a stranger, chased away by the echo of Abby's words and the memory of Jeremiah's eyes when he'd looked at her, not with anger, but with something far more dangerous: hope. She had built her life on the foundation of leaving, of never staying long enough for roots to take hold. Yet here she stood, paralyzed by the weight of a 6-year-old's innocent declaration. The kitchen felt different now, no longer just a workspace, but a stage where her carefully constructed defenses had crumbled in the span of a single evening. Footsteps on the stairs announced Jeremiah's descent, and Hazel turned to find him pausing in the doorway, his hair still bearing the imprint of his pillow, his shirt hastily buttoned. There was something vulnerable about seeing him this way, stripped of the composed facade he wore during daylight hours, and she felt her breath catch in her throat. "Coffee's fresh," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt, but he shook his head, moving instead to the window where she had been standing moments before. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, filled with all the words they couldn't bring themselves to speak, and Hazel found herself studying the line of his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the windowsill as if anchoring himself against some invisible storm. She wanted to ask him about his wife, about the woman whose absence filled every corner of this house like a ghost, but the questions felt too heavy, too intimate for the fragile space they now occupied. "She's never said anything like that before," Jeremiah finally spoke, his voice rough with sleep and something deeper. "About wanting a mother, I mean. I thought she was content with just me." The admission hung between them like a confession, and Hazel felt her heart constrict with the pain she heard beneath his words. She moved closer, drawn by an impulse she couldn't name, until she stood beside him at the window, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Children see things we miss," she said softly, watching as his jaw tightened with some internal struggle. Maybe she's been waiting for someone she felt safe enough to tell. The words surprised her with their gentleness, this woman who had spent years avoiding exactly this kind of emotional entanglement. Yet something about this man and his daughter had slipped past her defenses like water through stone. The sound of small feet on the stairs interrupted their moment, and they stepped apart, as if caught in some forbidden act, both turning toward the kitchen entrance where Abby appeared, her hair a tangle of golden curls, and her nightgown twisted from sleep. "Miss Hazel!" she exclaimed, her face lighting up with the kind of pure joy that made Hazel's chest ache with longing. "You're still here!" The child's relief was so palpable that Hazel felt tears prick at her eyes, understanding suddenly that Abby had feared she might disappear in the night, like so many other temporary figures in her young life. "Of course I'm here, sweetheart," Hazel heard herself say, kneeling down to Abby's level, her hands reaching out to smooth the child's unruly hair. "I promised I'd make you breakfast, didn't I?" But even as she spoke the words, she felt the weight of Jeremiah's gaze upon her, and she knew that this simple exchange was anything but simple, that every gesture, every word was being measured against the possibility of permanence. Abby threw her arms around Hazel's neck with the unconscious trust of childhood, and Hazel felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, like tectonic plates rearranging themselves after years of careful stability. The child smelled of sleep, and innocence, of dreams and the kind of hope that adults learn to temper with experience. And Hazel found herself holding on perhaps a moment too long, breathing in this feeling of being needed, of being chosen. When she finally pulled back, she caught sight of Jeremiah watching them, his expression unreadable, but his eyes bright with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "What would you like for breakfast, little one?" she asked, her voice slightly hoarse, and Abby's face scrunched up in concentration as if this were the most important decision she would ever make. "Pancakes," she declared finally. "The kind that look like flowers, like Mama used to make." "Redeem!" The words fell into the kitchen like stones into still water, creating ripples that touched every corner of the room. Jeremiah's face went carefully blank at the mention of his wife, but Hazel saw the flash of pain that crossed his features before he could hide it, and she felt her heart break a little for this man who was trying so hard to be everything his daughter needed while carrying the weight of his own grief. "I don't know how to make flour pancakes," Hazel admitted gently, watching as Abby's face fell slightly. "But maybe you could teach me. Maybe you remember how your mama did it." The suggestion was a risk, she knew, treading into territory that might be too tender to touch, but something in her refused to let this moment pass without acknowledging the woman who had come before her. Abby's eyes brightened again, and she nodded eagerly, already moving toward the pantry with the confidence of a child who knew her way around a kitchen. And Hazel felt a strange mixture of gratitude and sorrow for the mother who had taught her daughter these small, precious things before her time was cut short. The kitchen became a battlefield of flour and laughter, Abby's small hands guiding Hazel's larger ones as they attempted to recreate the flower-shaped pancakes that lived in the child's memory like sacred relics. Jeremiah had retreated to the table, ostensibly to drink his coffee, but Hazel could feel his eyes following their every movement, watching as his daughter animated with a joy he hadn't seen in months. "No, Miss Hazel, you have to make the petals pointy," Abby instructed, with the serious authority of a 6-year-old expert, her tongue poking out in concentration as she demonstrated the proper technique. "Mama always said the flowers had to look happy, not sad." The casual mention of her mother no longer seemed to carry the same weight of sorrow, and Hazel wondered if this was how healing began, not with grand gestures, but with the simple act of making pancakes on a Tuesday morning while the sun painted the kitchen walls gold. Flour dusted everything, the counter, their clothes, even Abby's nose where she had touched it with powdery fingers, and Hazel found herself laughing at the chaos they had created, a sound that felt rusty from disuse. She had forgotten what it felt like to be playful, to let go of the careful control she maintained over every aspect of her life, and the freedom was both exhilarating and terrifying. "I think your mama would be proud of these flowers," she said softly, flipping a particularly successful pancake that actually resembled something botanical, and she saw Abby's face light up with pride. "Do you think so? Do you think she can see them?" The question was asked with the innocent faith of childhood, and Hazel felt her throat tighten with emotion as she nodded. "I think she sees everything you do, sweetheart. I think she's very proud of what a good teacher you are." The words came from some deep place inside her, a place that believed in the continuity of love beyond the boundaries of life and death. From the corner of her eye, Hazel saw Jeremiah's hands tighten around his coffee cup, his knuckles white with the effort of containing whatever emotions Abby's questions had stirred up. She wanted to go to him, to offer some comfort for the pain she could see, etched in the lines around his eyes. But she didn't know if she had the right, didn't know if her presence would be welcome in his grief. Instead, she focused on Abby, on the simple task of creating something beautiful from flour and milk, and the memory of a woman she had never met, but whose presence filled this kitchen like sunlight through lace curtains. "Tell me about your mama," she said gently, surprising herself with the request, but something in her needed to know about the woman whose place she might be asked to fill. What else did she like to cook? The question opened a floodgate of memories, and Abby began chattering about apple pies and Sunday roasts, about the way her mother hummed while she worked, and how she always let Abby lick the spoon. The stories painted a picture of a woman who had been deeply loved, who had filled this house with warmth and laughter before illness stole her away, and Hazel felt the weight of that legacy settling on her shoulders like a mantle she wasn't sure she was worthy to wear. But as she listened to Abby's animated descriptions, she began to understand that the child wasn't looking for a replacement for her mother. She was looking for someone to help her keep those memories alive, someone to add new stories to the collection of love that defined this family. "She sounds like she was wonderful," Hazel said, when Abby finally paused for breath, and the child nodded solemnly. "She was the best mama in the whole world, but she told me before she went to heaven that it was okay to love other people too, that love doesn't run out like water in a well." The wisdom in those words, delivered with the matter-of-fact certainty of childhood, hit Hazel like a physical blow, and she had to turn away to hide the tears that suddenly blurred her vision. When she turned back, she found Jeremiah standing beside them, his face soft with an emotion she couldn't quite read, his hand resting gently on his daughter's head. "Your mama was very smart," he said quietly, his voice thick with feeling, and Hazel saw him swallow hard before continuing. "She always said that love was the one thing that got bigger when you shared it, not smaller." The words were clearly a quote, something his wife had said that he had carried with him through the dark months of grief, and Hazel felt honored to be included in this moment of remembrance. She reached out without thinking, her flower-dusted hand covering his where it rested on Abby's hair, and for a moment they stood connected, three people bound together by loss and hope and the simple act of making breakfast on a morning that had started like any other, but had somehow become the beginning of something new. The pancakes were imperfect, lopsided flowers that bore only a passing resemblance to their intended shape. But as they sat around the table eating them, Hazel thought they might be the most beautiful things she had ever created. Abby chattered between bites, her face sticky with syrup and bright with happiness, while Jeremiah ate in thoughtful silence, occasionally catching Hazel's eye across the table with a look that made her pulse quicken. The domesticity of the scene was almost overwhelming. This glimpse of what life could be like if she stopped running, if she allowed herself to believe that she deserved this kind of happiness. But even as she savored the moment, she could feel the familiar itch of restlessness stirring beneath her skin, the voice that whispered that this was too good to last, that she would only end up hurting these people who had already suffered enough loss. The afternoon stretched before them like an unwritten page, filled with the kind of lazy possibility that Hazel had forgotten existed outside of childhood memories. Abby had insisted on showing her the garden behind the house, a patch of earth that had once been her mother's pride, but now grew wild with neglect, and Hazel found herself kneeling in the dirt, her hands working automatically to pull weeds from around the struggling tomato plants. "Mama planted these before she got sick," Abby explained, her small fingers gentle as she touched the green fruit that hung heavy on the vines. "Papa tries to take care of them, but he says he doesn't have the magic touch like she did." The child's words carried no judgment, only the acceptance of a truth she had learned too young, and Hazel felt her heart ache for this little girl who spoke of loss with such matter-of-fact grace. Working in the garden felt like a meditation, the rhythm of pulling weeds and straightening stakes, grounding her in a way she hadn't experienced in years of constant movement. The earth was warm beneath her knees, rich and dark and full of promise, and she found herself imagining what this space could become with proper care, rows of vegetables and herbs, flowers blooming in careful abundance, a place where a family could gather the fruits of their labor and feel connected to something larger than themselves. "Miss Hazel," Abby said suddenly, her voice small and uncertain, "are you going to leave like the other ladies?" The question hit Hazel like a physical blow, and she sat back on her heels, looking into the child's earnest face with a heart that felt too full for her chest. "What other ladies, sweetheart?" she asked gently, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Abby's face scrunched up with the effort of remembering, her small hands twisting in the fabric of her dress as she spoke. There was Miss Sarah who came to help with the cooking, but she said Papa was too sad and it made her uncomfortable. And Miss Margaret, who was supposed to teach me letters, but she said I asked too many questions about Mama, and it wasn't healthy. Each name was delivered with the careful precision of a child who had learned to expect disappointment, and Hazel felt a surge of anger toward these women who had failed to see past their own discomfort to the needs of a grieving family. And then there was Miss Catherine, who Papa took to the church social, but she said our house felt like a tomb and she couldn't breathe in it. Adrikud, the final revelation was delivered in a whisper, and Hazel understood suddenly why Jeremiah had seemed so surprised by her easy acceptance of his daughter's emotional needs, why he watched her with such careful hope. The sound of boots on gravel announced Jeremiah's approach, and Hazel looked up to see him walking toward them, his shirt sleeves rolled up and his hat pushed back on his head, sweat gleaming on his forehead from whatever work had occupied his afternoon. There was something different about his posture, a looseness in his shoulders that spoke of a burden partially lifted, and Hazel wondered if the morning's easy domesticity had affected him as profoundly as it had her. "How are my girls doing?" he asked, the casual possessive in his words, making Hazel's breath catch, and she saw Abby beam at being included in that simple phrase. "Miss Hazel is helping Mama's tomatoes," Abby announced proudly, "and she says they just need a little love to grow big and strong." The child's interpretation of Hazel's earlier comments about the garden made Jeremiah's eyes soften, and he knelt down beside them, his large hands gentle as he examined the work they had done. "You've got a gift for this," he said quietly, his eyes meeting Hazel's over his daughter's head, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks at the approval in his voice. "My wife always said, the garden could tell you everything you needed to know about a person, whether they had patience, whether they understood that some things can't be rushed, whether they believed in tomorrow enough to plant seeds today." The words carried weight beyond their surface meaning, and Hazel understood that he was asking her something without actually forming the question, testing whether she was the kind of woman who believed in futures that required tending. "I've never had a garden of my own," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I think I'd like to learn." The confession felt like stepping off a cliff, acknowledging a desire she had never allowed herself to voice. And she saw something shift in Jeremiah's expression, hope blooming like the flowers Abby had taught her to make from pancake batter. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, the three of them sat on the porch steps, Abby nestled between the two adults like a bridge connecting their separate worlds. The child had grown quiet as the day wound down, her head heavy against Hazel's shoulder, and Hazel found herself stroking the little girl's hair with a tenderness that surprised her with its naturalness. "She's never taken to anyone the way she's taken to you," Jeremiah said softly, his voice carrying across the evening air like a prayer. "I was starting to think she never would again." The admission hung between them, heavy with implication, and Hazel felt the weight of decision settling on her shoulders, like a mantle she wasn't sure she was strong enough to bear. The familiar urge to run was there, whispering in the back of her mind about the safety of solitude, the freedom of roads that led nowhere in particular, the comfort of never staying long enough to disappoint or be disappointed. But stronger than that urge was the feeling of Abby's small body warm against her side, the memory of flour-dusted laughter in the kitchen, the way Jeremiah looked at her as if she might be the answer to prayers he had been afraid to voice. "I've spent so many years moving," she said finally, her voice barely audible above the evening chorus of crickets. "I'm not sure I remember how to stay." The words were both confession and question, an admission of fear wrapped in the hope that maybe, just maybe, this man and his daughter could teach her what she had never learned. That home wasn't a place you found, but a choice you made every day to love and be loved in return.